Thomas Wilson froze mid-step on the cracked sidewalk of Maple Street, his weathered hand clutching the pharmacy bag as the German Shepherd emerged from behind the abandoned Chevrolet. The dog wasn't just following him. It was maintaining perfect military heel position, 6 feet to his left rear, matching his pace with the precision of a trained soldier. This wasn't some lost pet. This was a warrior. Maria Santos dropped her groceries on her front porch, pointing with a trembling finger. Dios mío, Thomas. That dog. He's been waiting here every morning at 8 sharp for 3 weeks. The apples rolled across her steps like scattered ammunition. The faded military collar caught the autumn sunlight, and Thomas felt his chest tighten with recognition. 25 years of service had taught him to read the signs, the alert posture, the scanning eyes, the way this animal moved with deadly purpose through a civilian world that no longer needed what he'd been trained to do. "Where's your handler, boy?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking with sudden understanding. The dog's amber eyes held secrets that could destroy a man's heart. And somewhere in Colorado Springs, someone was running out of time. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Thomas Wilson had learned to measure his life in small defeats. At 68, the retired master sergeant existed in the narrow space between his morning pills and evening bourbon, counting down days in a house that echoed with ghosts. The ranch-style home on Maple Street had once buzzed with Margaret's laughter and the promise of golden years together. Now it served as a museum of what used to matter. Shadow boxes of military medals gathering dust, wedding photos turned face down, and a Purple Heart that felt heavier each time he moved it to dust the shelf. The $1,847 monthly pension stretched thin across mortgage payments, medical bills, and the mounting cost of staying alive when you no longer wanted to be. 7 prescription bottles lined his kitchen counter like tiny soldiers, sertraline for the depression that sat on his chest like a concrete block, prazosin for the nightmares that dragged him back to Afghan mountainsides, and 5 others that promised to manage what 25 years of service had broken inside him. Margaret used to organize them in a weekly pill dispenser with compartments labeled by day. Now, Thomas counted them out each morning, wondering if today would be the day he miscounted on purpose. The VA hospital on Academy Boulevard had become his second home, a sterile maze of waiting rooms filled with men and women who carried invisible wounds. Dr. James Rodriguez, his therapist, spoke in careful circles about survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress, using clinical terms for the simple truth that Thomas had watched better men die while he came home to an empty house. Afghanistan had taken his brothers in arms. Cancer had taken Margaret 2 years later. The math was simple. Everyone Thomas had ever loved was gone, and he remained, a broken remnant collecting government checks. His daily routine had crystallized into survival mode. Morning walk to the pharmacy for whatever new medication promised to quiet the voices of the dead. Afternoon trips to King Soopers, where he bought frozen dinners for one and avoided eye contact with couples shopping together. Evenings dissolved into bourbon and the military channel, where younger versions of himself fought wars that made sense, in a time when coming home meant something. The neighborhood around him had changed. Military families rotated through Fort Carson assignments, leaving and arriving with the regularity of tide tables. Maria Santos and her family had lived next door for 5 years now, the longest-staying neighbors he'd known. She left casseroles on his doorstep with notes written in careful English. Para el veterano. Thank you for your service. He ate them standing over the kitchen sink, tasting her kindness and his own shame in equal measure. Colorado Springs stretched beneath the Rocky Mountains like a promise of beauty that Thomas could no longer access. The peaks that had once stirred something in his chest now reminded him of Afghan ridgelines where friends had died. Even the crisp October air carried echoes of distant gunfire that only he could hear. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of convoy routes and the weight of decisions that had kept him alive when others hadn't been so fortunate. The German Shepherd first appeared on a Tuesday morning when October's chill had begun to bite through Thomas's worn navy peacoat. He was walking his usual route to the VA pharmacy, moving with the measured pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, when movement in his peripheral vision triggered instincts that 25 years of military service had carved into his bones. The dog emerged from behind the rusted shell of an abandoned Chevrolet like a ghost materializing from another lifetime. At first glance, Thomas assumed it was another stray. Colorado Springs had its share of abandoned animals, casualties of military families who received sudden deployment orders or couldn't afford veterinary bills on enlisted pay. But this dog moved differently. While strays typically approached with the desperate, submissive posture of creatures seeking food or shelter, this German Shepherd maintained a respectful distance and fell into step exactly 6 feet behind Thomas's left shoulder. The position was too precise to be coincidental, too practiced to be accidental. "Go on home, boy," Thomas muttered over his shoulder, but the dog continued its measured pace, neither closing the distance nor falling behind. When Thomas stopped at the crosswalk on Academy Boulevard, the dog sat without command, ears alert and scanning for threats with the systematic thoroughness of a trained sentry. When the light changed and Thomas moved forward, the dog rose and resumed its position with military precision. The pharmacy visit took 15 minutes, long enough for Thomas to collect his monthly supply of medications and exchange pleasantries with the pharmacist who knew him by name and diagnosis. When he emerged, he expected to find the street empty, but the German Shepherd waited exactly where he'd been left, sitting at perfect attention beside the newspaper boxes. The dog's coat showed signs of outdoor living, burrs caught in the longer fur around his neck, dust settled into the deep gold and black coloring, but his bearing remained proud, almost regal. The walk home became a strange parade of two. Thomas found himself automatically adjusting his pace to accommodate his uninvited companion, though the dog seemed perfectly capable of matching any speed. They moved through the residential streets like a small unit on patrol, and Thomas caught himself scanning doorways and alleys with renewed attention, as if the dog's alertness had awakened something in him that had been dormant since his discharge. Maria Santos was sweeping her front porch when they passed her house, and she straightened with surprise at the sight of Thomas's companion. "De donde vino ese perro?" she called out, her English heavily accented but warm with genuine concern. "Where did that dog come from?" "He's not mine," Thomas replied. But even as he said it, something in his chest loosened slightly. The dog had positioned himself between Thomas and the street, a subtle but unmistakable protective stance that spoke of training far beyond basic obedience. The pattern continued for days. Each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, Thomas would find the German Shepherd waiting at the end of his driveway. The dog never approached the house directly, never scratched at doors or windows, but maintained his vigil with the patience of a professional. Thomas began to look forward to these encounters, though he told himself it was merely curiosity about the animal's origins and training. By the end of the first week, Thomas had started carrying an extra bottle of water and a handful of crackers in his jacket pocket. He told himself this was simple human decency. The dog was clearly living rough, and October nights in Colorado could be brutal. But when he set the water bowl down and watched the dog drink with careful, controlled movements, never gulping desperately as a truly starved animal would, Thomas began to suspect this was no ordinary stray. The breakthrough came during their second week together. A car backfired on Platt Avenue, the sharp crack echoing off surrounding buildings with the unmistakable report of gunfire. Thomas's body reacted before his mind could process the sound, muscles tensing, heart rate spiking, hand reaching automatically for a sidearm that hadn't been there for 3 years. But before the familiar tide of panic could overwhelm him, he felt a warm, solid weight pressing against his leg. The German Shepherd had moved without hesitation, positioning his body as a buffer between Thomas and the perceived threat. The dog's presence was calm but alert, and somehow his steady breathing and solid warmth cut through the flashback before it could fully take hold. Thomas found himself placing a trembling hand on the dog's head, feeling the reassuring reality of coarse fur and warm skin beneath his palm. "You know, don't you?" Thomas whispered. And the dog turned intelligent amber eyes up to meet his gaze. In that moment, Thomas recognized something he hadn't seen in 3 years of VA appointments and therapy sessions. Another soldier who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds, who knew the weight of watching brothers fall and coming home alone. The dog's collar, he noticed for the first time, bore the faded remnants of military tags. The transformation began on a gray Wednesday morning when Thomas woke to find the German Shepherd collapsed in his driveway, sides heaving with labored breathing that misted in the cold air. For 3 weeks, the dog had maintained his professional distance, but now he lay curled against Thomas's garage door like an exhausted sentry who had finally abandoned his post. Thomas knelt beside him, his arthritic joints protesting as he reached out to touch the dog's flank. The animal's fur was soaked with rain from the storm that had passed through during the night, and Thomas could feel the sharp outline of ribs beneath the matted coat. "Jesus, boy, how long have you been fighting this alone?" The decision to bring the dog inside wasn't really a decision at all. It was instinct, the same impulse that had once driven Thomas to drag wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. He coaxed the German Shepherd to his feet and guided him through the front door, watching as the animal immediately began scanning the interior with professional thoroughness, despite his obvious illness. Once inside, the dog's training became impossible to ignore. He moved through Thomas's house like a soldier conducting a security sweep, checking corners and sight lines with systematic precision. When Thomas gestured toward the living room, the dog automatically positioned himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of all entry points. Most remarkably, when Thomas unconsciously used hand signals, a raised palm for stay, a downward motion for down, the dog responded with immediate compliance. "You're military, aren't you?" Thomas said softly, settling into his recliner as the dog claimed a position on the rug nearby. "The question is, where's your handler?" That afternoon, while the dog slept fitfully on the living room floor, Thomas examined the collar more closely. The leather was quality military issue, designed to withstand harsh conditions, but years of weather had faded most of the markings. Using a magnifying glass from Margaret's old sewing kit, he could make out partial letters stamped into a metal tag, MWDR3X, followed by what appeared to be F.T. Carson, and a partially legible name beginning with W.W. Thompson. The internet search that followed opened a door Thomas hadn't expected. Military working dog databases were largely classified, but public records and obituaries told their own story. Sergeant Major William Bear Thompson, age 42, had been killed in action in Afghanistan on September 15, 2021. The brief military summary mentioned that Thompson had been serving as a handler with the military police K9 unit, partnered with a German Shepherd designated MWD Rex. Thomas stared at the screen until the words blurred, his hands trembling as memories began to surface with unexpected clarity. September 15, 2021. He remembered that date because it should have been his convoy. Food poisoning had kept him on base that morning, violently ill and unfit for duty. Bear Thompson had volunteered to take Thomas's place in the convoy, a gesture of brotherhood that was common in their tight-knit unit. The IED that killed Bear Thompson had been meant for Thomas Wilson. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over in his desk chair as the weight of survivor's guilt crashed down with renewed force. For 3 years, he had carried the knowledge that better men had died while he came home, but he hadn't known the specific names, the faces, the stories of sacrifice. Now he knew that Bear Thompson had died in his place, and Bear's partner, Rex, had been searching for something, someone, anyone connected to his handler's memory. "Oh, God," Thomas whispered, looking across the room at the sleeping dog. "You've been looking for him, haven't you? For 3 years, you've been trying to find your way back to Bear." That evening, Thomas called Fort Carson's Military Working Dog Unit, navigating a maze of automated systems and transfer protocols before reaching Captain Jennifer Hayes. Her voice was professionally courteous but guarded when Thomas explained his situation. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but military working dogs are government property," Captain Hayes said. "Their disposition after retirement or handler loss follows specific protocols." "Then what's Rex doing living on the streets?" Thomas pressed. "According to my research, he should have been retired and adopted through proper channels after Sergeant Thompson's death." There was a long pause before Captain Hayes responded. "Our records show that MWD Rex was officially adopted by Sergeant Thompson's next of kin 3 years ago." "If you're claiming to have found him as a stray, then there may have been some kind of miscommunication." The careful phrasing sent warning signals through Thomas's trained instincts. Who was the next of kin? "Michael Thompson, the sergeant's son. He lives in Denver." That night, Thomas sat in his recliner with Rex sleeping at his feet, feeling the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form. A military dog doesn't simply wander away from a loving home to live on the streets for 3 years. Rex's behavior, the systematic searching, the attachment to Thomas specifically, the way he'd maintained military bearing despite obvious hardship, suggested something far more troubling than a simple case of a lost pet. Thomas reached down to stroke Rex's head, feeling the dog stir and press closer against his leg. "What happened to you, boy?" "What did Michael Thompson do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with it the promise of answers that might be more painful than the mystery itself. But Thomas had learned something important during his years of service. Sometimes the hardest battles were the ones you had to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Rex deserved the truth, and Thomas Wilson, despite his broken pieces and haunted nights, might be the only person left who could find it. The phone call to Michael Thompson shattered any illusions Thomas might have harbored about a simple misunderstanding. When a gruff voice answered on the 4th ring, Thomas introduced himself carefully, explaining that he'd found a German shepherd that appeared to belong to the Thompson family. "That dog should have died with my father," Michael's voice cut through the line like a blade. "I got rid of him 3 years ago, and I don't want him back. Dogs like that are weapons, not pets. You military types have caused enough damage." The line went dead, leaving Thomas staring at his phone with a mixture of shock and growing anger. He looked down at Rex, who was lying near his feet, amber eyes watching Thomas's face with the intense attention of an animal who had learned to read human emotions for survival. "Son of a bitch abandoned you," Thomas said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "His father died serving his country, and he threw you away like garbage." The next morning, Thomas made the drive to Fort Carson with Rex riding shotgun in his pickup truck. The dog became increasingly agitated as they approached the base gates, whining softly and pressing himself against the passenger door. Thomas had to show 3 forms of identification and explain his purpose twice before gaining visitor access to speak with Captain Hayes. The military working dog facility was a complex of kennels and training areas where the sound of barking mixed with the sharp commands of handlers putting their partners through exercises. Captain Hayes met them in a small office that smelled of disinfectant and dog treats. her expression carefully neutral as she watched Rex explore the familiar environment. "He knows this place," she observed, noting how Rex immediately positioned himself at Thomas's left side in a perfect heel position. "His training is still intact even after 3 years on his own." Thomas studied the young officer's face, reading the tension around her eyes. What really happened when Sergeant Thompson died? Why wasn't Rex properly placed? Captain Hayes sighed, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Officially, Rex was retired due to psychological trauma following his handler's death. The son, Michael, had legal standing as next of kin, and he insisted on taking custody immediately. We had concerns about the placement, but our hands were tied by regulations." Concerns? Michael Thompson made it clear during the paperwork process that he blamed Rex for his father's death. He kept saying the dog should have protected Bear better, that military dogs were failed experiments that cost more than they were worth. She paused, watching Rex settle into a down position beside Thomas's chair. "We tried to suggest alternative placements, but he was adamant. Said it was his right to decide the dog's fate." The picture that emerged was uglier than Thomas had imagined. Michael Thompson had driven Rex to a high-kill shelter in Pueblo, nearly 200 miles south of Colorado Springs, and surrendered him with explicit instructions that he was aggressive and unsuitable for adoption. Only Rex's military training and survival instincts had saved him from euthanization, and somehow he had escaped or been released, beginning a 3-year journey back to Fort Carson to find someone, anyone, connected to his lost handler. "Why didn't the military intervene?" Thomas asked, his anger building. "We have protocols, but they don't account for family members who want revenge against a dead soldier's dog," Captain Hayes admitted. "By the time we learned what really happened, Rex had already disappeared from the shelter system. We assumed he'd been put down." That afternoon, Thomas took Rex to see Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veterinarian whose small clinic near the base specialized in military working dogs. Dr. Mitchell was a compact woman in her 40s with graying hair and the steady hands of someone who had seen trauma in its many forms. She greeted Rex with professional calm, but Thomas noticed her sharp intake of breath when she saw the scars crossing the dog's right flank. "IED blast?" she asked, running her hands along Rex's ribs with practiced expertise. "Afghanistan, 2021, Thomas confirmed. He was with his handler when Sergeant Thompson was killed." Dr. Mitchell's examination revealed the physical toll of Rex's 3 years of survival. Malnutrition had left him 20 pounds underweight, and old injuries had healed improperly without veterinary care. Most concerning were signs of chronic stress, elevated heart rate, hypervigilance, and a startle response that spoke of trauma that went far beyond physical wounds. "He's been living in constant fight or flight mode, Doctor," Mitchell explained, her voice softening as she watched Rex lean into Thomas's touch. "Military working dogs form incredibly strong bonds with their handlers. When that bond is severed traumatically, and then the dog is abandoned by the handler's family." She shook her head. "It's a miracle he survived at all." The financial reality of Rex's care hit Thomas like a convoy ambush. The examination alone cost $180, and Dr. Mitchell's treatment plan included blood work, X-rays, dental care, and medications that would total nearly $3,000. Thomas stared at the estimate, doing mental arithmetic with his monthly pension and rapidly dwindling savings account. "I'll take care of the essentials first," he said finally, though his voice betrayed the strain. "The rest will have to wait." Dr. Mitchell studied him for a long moment. "You're a veteran?" 25 years, Master Sergeant. Retired." "Then this is cost of supplies only," she said, marking through several line items on the estimate. "Military families take care of each other. That includes the 4-legged members." The kindness in her voice nearly undid Thomas completely. He had spent 3 years feeling disconnected from his military community, isolated by grief and survivor's guilt. Now, faced with Dr. Mitchell's matter-of-fact generosity and Rex's unwavering loyalty, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death: belonging. Over the following weeks, a routine developed that gave structure to Thomas's previously aimless days. Morning physical training became a shared ritual, Thomas's arthritic joints protesting as he worked through modified calisthenics, while Rex performed his own conditioning exercises with the precision of muscle memory. The dog's presence during Thomas's PTSD episodes was nothing short of miraculous, as if Rex could sense the approaching flashbacks and position himself as an anchor to the present moment. The financial strain, however, continued to mount. Thomas found himself skipping meals to afford Rex's medication, rationing his own prescriptions to stretch the budget. Pride prevented him from asking for help, but Maria Santos noticed the changes immediately. "Estás más delgado," she observed one morning, handing Thomas a container of homemade tamales. "You're getting thinner. That dog, he needs to eat, but so do you." Her concern was echoed by other neighbors who had watched the unlikely partnership develop. Jake Morrison, a retired Air Force mechanic who lived 3 houses down, started leaving bags of dog food on Thomas's porch without comment. Sarah Chen, whose husband was deployed with the 4th Infantry Division, began including extra portions when she cooked family meals. The community support was both humbling and healing, but it also attracted attention. Thomas hadn't wanted. A photographer from the Colorado Springs Gazette caught him and Rex at a Veterans Day ceremony at Memorial Park, resulting in a feature story titled "Lost Military Dog Finds Purpose with Fellow Veteran." The article painted their partnership in heroic terms, describing Rex's 3-year search and Thomas's commitment to caring for an abandoned military working dog. The story went viral on social media, shared thousands of times by military families and animal lovers who were moved by the tale of loyalty and redemption. Thomas received dozens of emails from strangers offering support, and a GoFundMe page organized by Maria Santos raised nearly $8,000 in 2 weeks. But the attention also reached Michael Thompson in Denver. The confrontation came on a cold November morning when Thomas returned from his walk to find 2 animal control officers waiting in his driveway alongside a man in his mid-30s with his father's strong jaw and bitter eyes. Michael Thompson had aged poorly, his face bearing the hard lines of someone who had nursed resentment until it poisoned everything around him. "That dog belongs to me," Michael announced without preamble, producing a folder of legal documents. "I'm his registered owner, and I want him back today." Thomas felt Rex tense beside him, the dog's body language shifting into high alert. "If you owned him, why has he been living on the streets for 3 years?" "What I do with my property is my business," Michael snapped. "You've been harboring stolen goods, old man. That's a felony." The animal control officers looked uncomfortable with the situation, but the paperwork was legitimate. Officer Martinez, a young Hispanic woman with kind eyes, approached Thomas apologetically. "Sir, we have to follow the law. The dog is registered to Mr. Thompson, and he's demanding return of his property." Thomas's mind raced through options, but every path led to the same devastating conclusion. Without legal ownership, he had no rights to Rex, regardless of the circumstances of their partnership. The system that had failed Rex 3 years ago was about to fail him again. "You have 24 hours to contest this through the courts," Officer Martinez said quietly, clearly hoping Thomas would find a way to fight. "After that, we have to execute the recovery order." That night, Thomas sat on his living room floor with Rex pressed against his side, both of them understanding that their time together was measured in hours rather than years. Thomas had survived IEDs, firefights, and the death of his wife, but the thought of losing Rex to Michael Thompson's vindictive cruelty felt like a wound he might not survive. "I won't let him hurt you again," Thomas whispered into Rex's fur, though he had no idea how to keep that promise. "There has to be a way." Rex looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes that had seen too much betrayal for one lifetime, and Thomas felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Some battles chose you whether you were ready or not. The El Paso County Courthouse had seen its share of custody battles, but few as unusual as the case of Wilson Fertel Thompson over the fate of a retired military working dog. Thomas sat at a scarred wooden table next to a court-appointed attorney barely out of law school, watching Michael Thompson confer with his expensive Denver lawyer across the aisle. Rex lay at Thomas's feet, his presence a source of comfort even as the legal machinery prepared to separate them permanently. Judge Patricia Hendricks was a stern woman in her 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her impatience with frivolous cases. She reviewed the paperwork with the methodical attention of someone who understood that lives often hung in the balance of legal technicalities. "This is highly irregular," Judge Hendricks observed, looking over her reading glasses at both parties. "We're here to determine custody of what the law considers personal property, but I'm told this involves a military working dog with significant service history." Michael Thompson's lawyer, a polished man named Bradley Pierce, stood first. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. My client is the legal heir of Sergeant Major William Thompson, killed in action serving his country. Upon his father's death, Michael Thompson legally adopted the dog through proper military channels. Mr. Wilson has unlawfully harbored this animal for months, essentially stealing family property worth thousands of dollars in training investments." Pierce produced a folder thick with documentation, adoption papers, veterinary records, and registration documents that painted an official picture of legitimate ownership. "My client has every right to reclaim his property, and Mr. Wilson's emotional attachment, however admirable, doesn't supersede legal ownership." Thomas's attorney, Jennifer Park, was 28 years old and handling her first case involving military animals. She stood nervously, shuffling through notes that seemed inadequate against Pierce's polished presentation. "Your Honor, while Mr. Thompson may have technical ownership, the evidence shows he abandoned Rex 3 years ago at a high-kill shelter 200 miles from here. The dog has been living as a stray ever since, forming a therapeutic bond with my client, a disabled veteran suffering from PTSD." Judge Hendricks interrupted. "Miss Park, abandonment is a serious allegation. Do you have evidence to support this claim?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Thomas had spent sleepless nights trying to locate witnesses from the Pueblo shelter, but staff turnover and poor record-keeping had made verification nearly impossible. Dr. Mitchell had provided testimony about Rex's condition when Thomas found him, but that alone wouldn't prove deliberate abandonment. "We have circumstantial evidence, Your Honor," Park admitted, her voice faltering slightly. "The dog's physical condition, his location hundreds of miles from his registered address, and the 3-year gap in care all suggest—" "Speculation," Pierce interrupted smoothly. "Animals escape. They get lost. My client was grieving his father's death and may not have been able to properly secure the dog. That doesn't constitute legal abandonment." Michael Thompson took the witness stand with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. He wore a dark suit that emphasized his resemblance to his father, though where Bear Thompson's military photos showed strength and compassion, Michael's face held only bitter resentment. "Tell the court about your father's relationship with Rex," Pierce prompted. Michael's jaw tightened. "My father cared more about that dog than his own family. He missed my mother's funeral for a deployment, chose the military over everything that should have mattered. When he died, that dog became a symbol of everything wrong with his priorities." The honesty was brutal and damaging to his case, but Michael seemed incapable of moderating his bitterness. "I took the dog because it was my legal right. What happened after that is my business." "And what did happen?" Judge Hendricks asked, leaning forward with interest. "I realized I couldn't live with the daily reminder of my father's choices," Michael said, his voice hardening. "So I found him a new home." "At a kill shelter in Pueblo?" "It was a shelter. They assured me he would be placed appropriately." The lie was transparent but unprovable. Thomas watched Judge Hendricks' expression shift subtly, recognizing the look of someone who had heard enough evasion to smell deception from across a courtroom. When Thomas took the stand, the weight of 3 months with Rex settled into his testimony like muscle memory. He described finding the dog on Maple Street, the gradual recognition of military training, the slow process of healing that had benefited them both. His voice remained steady until Jennifer Park asked him to describe Rex's condition when they first met. "He was surviving, not living," Thomas said, his composure finally cracking. 20 pounds underweight, old injuries healed wrong, scared of every loud noise, but the worst part was his eyes. He looked like a soldier who'd lost his unit and didn't know how to stop searching. "How has caring for Rex affected your own recovery?" Thomas glanced down at Rex, who was watching the proceedings with alert attention. "He gave me a mission again. For 3 years after Margaret died, I was just counting down days. Rex needed someone to fight for him, and I needed something to fight for." During cross-examination, Pierce attacked Thomas's mental stability with surgical precision. "Mr. Wilson, isn't it true that you've been hospitalized twice for psychiatric episodes related to your military service?" "I've received treatment for PTSD, yes." "And you're currently taking 7 different psychiatric medications?" "I take medication to manage service-connected disabilities, yes." "Is it possible that your attachment to this dog is based on delusion rather than the animal's actual needs?" The question was designed to undermine Thomas's credibility, but it revealed Pierce's fundamental misunderstanding of the bond between soldiers and their working partners. Thomas straightened in his chair, finding reserves of strength he'd forgotten he possessed. "Sir, I've served with military working dogs in 3 combat deployments. I know the difference between a trained animal and a pet. Rex isn't just any dog. He's a combat veteran who served his country with honor. He deserves better than being treated as property by someone who sees him as a symbol of resentment." The most devastating testimony came from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who appeared as an expert witness on military working dog psychology. Her credentials were impeccable. Former Army veterinarian, specialist in canine PTSD, consultant to the Department of Defense on retired MWD placement. "Military working dogs form intense bonds with their handlers," Dr. Mitchell explained to the court. "When that bond is severed by death, the psychological trauma can be severe. Rex's behavior when Mr. Wilson found him, the systematic searching, the attachment to another veteran, the maintenance of military protocols despite obvious hardship, all indicate a dog trying to complete his mission to serve and protect." "In your professional opinion," Park asked, "what would be the psychological impact of removing Rex from his current placement with Mr. Wilson?" Dr. Mitchell's answer was unequivocal. "It would be devastating. Rex has found stability and purpose again. Removing him to an environment where he's seen as an unwanted reminder would likely trigger severe psychological regression. In extreme cases, military working dogs have died from what can only be described as broken hearts." The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Judge Hendricks made notes with sharp, precise strokes, her expression revealing nothing. During the final arguments, Pierce maintained his position that legal ownership trumped emotional considerations. "The law is clear, Your Honor. Property rights exist to prevent exactly this kind of situation, where good intentions override legal ownership. Mr. Wilson's service is commendable, but it doesn't give him the right to keep another man's dog." Jennifer Park's closing argument was passionate but legally weak. She appealed to the court's compassion, describing the therapeutic relationship between Thomas and Rex, the community support their partnership had generated, and the obvious trauma that separation would cause both veteran and dog. Judge Hendricks retired for deliberation, leaving both sides to wait in the courthouse hallway. Thomas sat on a wooden bench with Rex beside him, receiving encouraging words from supporters who had filled the gallery: Maria Santos, Jake Morrison, other veterans from his therapy group, even strangers who had followed their story in the media. Michael Thompson stood apart with his lawyer, checking his phone with the impatience of someone accustomed to getting his way quickly. The contrast was stark. Thomas surrounded by community support, Michael isolated by his own bitterness. When court reconvened, Judge Hendricks delivered her ruling with the measured cadence of someone who understood the weight of her words. This case presents a conflict between legal ownership and moral responsibility. While I find Mr. Thompson's treatment of this animal morally objectionable, the law is clear regarding property rights. Thomas felt his heart sink, but the judge wasn't finished. However, I also find credible evidence that Mr. Thompson abandoned this dog 3 years ago with reckless disregard for its welfare. Therefore, I'm ordering a 30-day evaluation period during which Rex will remain in the custody of animal control, while both parties undergo court-ordered mediation to determine the best placement for this military working dog. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and solved nothing, but it gave Thomas 30 days to find another solution. As Rex was led away in a transport cage, looking back at Thomas with confusion and growing panic, Thomas felt something break inside him that might never heal. The battle was far from over, but watching Rex disappear behind the steel doors of the animal control facility felt like the first defeat in a war Thomas couldn't afford to lose. The animal control facility on Research Parkway operated with the sterile efficiency of a government institution, but no amount of professional competence could mask the fundamental tragedy of its purpose. Rex had been assigned to kennel number 7 in a row of chain-link enclosures that housed the unwanted, the lost, and the legally disputed. Thomas arrived for his first visitation at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, his hands trembling as he signed the visitor log with fingers that could barely hold a pen steady. Officer Martinez led him through the concrete corridors, where the sound of barking echoed off bare walls like artillery in a canyon. "He's been quiet since he got here," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Won't eat, barely drinks water, just lies there staring at the door." The sight of Rex in the kennel hit Thomas like a physical blow to the chest. The proud military bearing was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed resignation of an animal who had endured one abandonment too many. Rex lay curled in the far corner of his concrete cell, his magnificent coat already beginning to lose its luster. When he saw Thomas approach, his tail moved once in a weak acknowledgement, but he didn't rise to greet his visitor. "Hey, boy," Thomas whispered, pressing his fingers through the chain link. Rex lifted his head but remained in place, as if movement itself had become too great an effort. The message was clear. He had been betrayed before by hope, and he wouldn't risk it again. Thomas spent the full hour of visitation sitting on the concrete floor outside the kennel, talking in low, steady tones about nothing and everything. He described the weather, the neighborhood news, Maria Santos's latest casserole offerings, anything to maintain the connection that legal proceedings had severed. Rex listened with the polite attention of a soldier receiving orders he no longer believed would lead anywhere good. The second day was worse. Rex had refused all food for 48 hours, and Dr. Peterson, the facility veterinarian, met Thomas in the lobby with the grave expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "He's shutting down," Dr. Peterson explained bluntly. "Military working dogs can literally die from emotional trauma. We've seen it before with retired dogs who lose their handlers or get placed in incompatible situations." "How long?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "At this rate, 2 weeks, maybe less." He's a 9-year-old dog who's been through hell multiple times. His body is giving up because his spirit already has. That night, Thomas sat in his empty living room with a glass of bourbon that remained untouched as the ice cubes melted into useless slivers. The house felt cavernous without Rex's presence, every creak and settling sound magnified by the absence of another living being. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on him with the weight of accumulated failures. His failure to save his brothers in Afghanistan, his failure to prevent Margaret's death, and now his failure to protect Rex from a system that viewed him as property rather than a hero. The phone rang at 2 a.m, jarring Thomas from a restless doze in his recliner. Dr. Mitchell's voice was tight with urgency. "Thomas, I need you to come to my clinic immediately, and don't ask questions over the phone." The drive through Colorado Springs' empty streets felt surreal, streetlights creating pools of amber light that flickered past like memories half remembered. Dr. Mitchell's clinic was dark except for a single light in the back examination room, where Thomas found her waiting with the expression that mixed determination with something that looked dangerously close to conspiracy. "I've been doing some digging into Rex's military records," she began without preamble, "and I found something that changes everything." She opened a thick folder on the examination table, revealing photocopied documents marked with official military seals. "I was Bear Thompson's unit medic in Afghanistan. I was there the day he died." The revelation hit Thomas like a sledgehammer. Dr. Mitchell had been treating Rex knowing exactly what had happened on that convoy route, knowing the specific details of Bear Thompson's death and Rex's heroic actions during the ambush. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas managed. "Because I needed to be sure about your motivations first. Too many people want to own military dogs for the wrong reasons. Status symbols, guard dogs, bragging rights. But you—" She paused, studying his face in the harsh fluorescent light. "You genuinely care about Rex as an individual, not as a symbol." Dr. Mitchell pulled out a tablet and activated a video file that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. The grainy footage showed helmet camera recordings from the convoy attack, time-stamped September 15, 2021. Thomas watched his own near-death experience unfold from Bear Thompson's perspective, seeing for the first time the IED explosion that should have killed him, the chaos that followed, and Rex's desperate attempts to reach both wounded soldiers. "This is classified footage," Dr. Mitchell said quietly. "It shows Rex detecting the IED and alerting the convoy. He saved 3 soldiers that day, including the man Bear was covering for. Rex tried to drag both wounded men to safety. He was shot twice trying to reach Bear, but Bear was already gone. Rex didn't fail his mission. He exceeded it." The footage continued, showing Rex's wounds being treated in the field, his refusal to leave Bear's body until ordered to do so by the medics. Thomas watched himself being loaded into a medevac helicopter, while Rex sat guard over his handler's remains, maintaining his post even while bleeding from his own injuries. "Michael Thompson has spent 3 years believing Rex failed to protect his father," Dr. Mitchell continued. "But the truth is that Rex is the reason you're alive today. Bear died saving you, and Rex nearly died trying to save both of you." Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, a realignment of guilt and responsibility that he had carried for 3 years. "Michael doesn't know. The Army classified the tactical details to protect intelligence sources. The family was only told that Bear died in an ambush. They never knew about Rex's heroism or the fact that Bear specifically chose to take your place in that convoy." The weight of revelation was crushing and liberating simultaneously. Thomas finally understood why Rex had sought him out, why the dog had maintained his vigil for 3 years. It wasn't random chance or simple loneliness. It was completion of a mission that had begun on a dusty road in Afghanistan when Bear Thompson made the decision to save a fellow soldier's life. "We have to tell Michael the truth," Thomas said. Dr. Mitchell nodded grimly. "Tomorrow, because Rex doesn't have much time left, and neither do we." The drive to Denver felt like traveling through a landscape of reckoning, each mile bringing Thomas closer to a confrontation that would either save Rex or destroy the last hope they had left. Dr. Mitchell sat in the passenger seat of his pickup truck, the classified footage stored on her tablet like digital evidence of heroism that had been buried under 3 years of bureaucratic silence. The autumn mountains of Colorado rose around them, indifferent to the human drama playing out in the cab of a veteran's aging Ford. Michael Thompson lived in a suburban development that spoke of middle-class success built on resentment. The houses were identical boxes with small yards and attached garages, the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business and kept their struggles private. Michael's house at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive stood out only for its neglected lawn and the absence of any decorations or personal touches that might suggest someone actually lived there, rather than merely existed. Thomas knocked on the door with the measured cadence of a military courtesy call, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the afternoon stillness. When Michael opened the door, his resemblance to his father was even more striking in person. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, but where Bear's face had shown strength and compassion in the military photographs, Michael's features had been hardened by years of nursing grievances. "What the hell do you want?" Michael's voice carried the flat hostility of someone who had been expecting this confrontation. "If you're here to beg for that dog, you can save your breath. The court will rule in my favor, and then I'll decide what happens to him. We're here to show you something about your father's death, Doctor," Mitchell said quietly, stepping forward with her medical credentials lending weight to her words. "Something the Army never told you." The mention of his father's death shifted something in Michael's expression, anger giving way to wary curiosity. "I know how my father died. IED attack on a convoy route in Afghanistan. End of story." "No," Thomas said, meeting Michael's hostile gaze with steady determination. "That's not the end of the story. That's barely the beginning." Michael let them into his living room, a space that felt more like a waiting room than a home. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, and the walls held no family photographs, no military memorabilia, no evidence of the proud lineage that should have connected him to his father's service. Thomas noticed the absence immediately. In most military families, the walls would be covered with deployment photos, unit patches, awards, and commendations that told the story of sacrifice and service. "Doctor." Mitchell set up her tablet on the coffee table with the careful precision of someone preparing to detonate an emotional IED. "Michael, I was your father's medic in Afghanistan. I was there the day he died, and I've spent 3 years living with classified information that you had the right to know." "Classified information?" Michael's voice carried a note of skepticism mixed with growing unease. "The tactical details of the convoy attack were classified to protect intelligence sources," Dr. Mitchell explained. "But you deserve to know the truth about what your father did that day, and about Rex's actions during the ambush." She activated the video file, and suddenly the room filled with the grainy helmet cam footage of Bear Thompson's final mission. Michael watched himself staring at images of his father's last day alive, seeing for the first time the man who had chosen duty over family comfort, but who had also chosen to save another soldier's life in the process. The footage was brutal in its clarity. Bear Thompson taking Thomas's place in the convoy because of food poisoning that had left Thomas unfit for duty. The convoy rolling through dusty Afghan terrain that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Rex alert in the vehicle, his trained senses scanning for threats that human noses couldn't detect. "Watch Rex," Dr. Mitchell said softly. "Watch how he alerts to the IED." The video showed Rex suddenly stiffening, his body language shifting to high alert as he detected explosive residue carried on the wind. His trained warning signals were immediate and unmistakable, a series of behaviors that should have given the convoy precious seconds to react to the threat. But the IED was too close, the ambush too well planned. The explosion filled the screen with white light and chaos, the camera spinning wildly as Bear's vehicle took the brunt of the blast. When the image stabilized, it showed Rex dragging himself through the wreckage despite wounds that should have been fatal, his only focus getting to his fallen handler. Michael's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he watched his father's final moments unfold with a clarity that no military casualty notification had ever provided. The dog tried to save him. Rex was shot twice trying to reach your father, Thomas said, his own voice thick with emotion as he relived the day that had changed everything. He pulled 2 other soldiers to safety first, including the man your father had volunteered to replace. Rex didn't fail his mission, he exceeded it. The video continued, showing Rex's refusal to leave Bear's body even as medics worked to save his own life. The dog maintained his protective position over his handler's remains until he was forcibly removed for medical treatment, his loyalty absolute even in the face of his own mortal wounds. "Your father didn't die because Rex failed," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "Your father died because he chose to save another man's life, and Rex nearly died trying to save them both." Michael stared at the frozen image on the tablet screen, his father's final moments captured in government pixels that revealed truths the family had never been allowed to know. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "The Army told us he died instantly in an IED attack. They said it was quick, that he didn't suffer." "He didn't suffer," Thomas confirmed. "But he also didn't die pointlessly. He died saving me. And Rex has been carrying that knowledge for 3 years, trying to complete his mission by protecting another soldier from your father's unit." The revelation shattered something fundamental in Michael's understanding of his father's death and his own response to it. For 3 years, he had carried rage at a military system that he believed had taken his father for nothing, leaving a family to grieve while a dog received better care than the widow and son left behind. But the footage revealed a different narrative, one of heroic choice, canine loyalty, and a mission that had continued long after the official war ended. "I've spent 3 years hating him," Michael said, staring at his hands. 3 years believing that dog let my father down, that the military cared more about animals than people. "The military made mistakes," Dr. Mitchell acknowledged. "They should have told you the truth about Rex's actions, should have ensured proper placement for a hero dog. But Rex isn't responsible for those institutional failures. He's just a soldier who's been trying to serve and protect for 3 years without a unit to belong to." Thomas leaned forward, seeing an opening in Michael's emotional armor. "Your father loved that dog because Rex represented the best of military service, loyalty, courage, selfless dedication to the mission. When you abandoned Rex, you weren't just punishing a dog, you were rejecting everything your father stood for." The accusation hit Michael like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch away from it. Instead, he seemed to collapse inward, the anger that had sustained him for 3 years suddenly revealed as grief that had never been properly processed. "I was so mad at him for leaving us. Mom was sick, and he kept deploying, kept choosing the Army over his family. When he died, I wanted to hurt something connected to him." "But he didn't choose the Army over family," Thomas said quietly. "He chose to save another man's life because that's what soldiers do for each other. And Rex has been trying to honor that choice by protecting me the way your father would have wanted." Michael looked up at Thomas with eyes that suddenly looked younger than his 34 years, as if the hatred had been aging him prematurely. What happens to Rex now? That depends on you, Dr. Mitchell said. Rex is dying in that animal control facility. Military working dogs can literally die from emotional trauma, and he's already shutting down. He's got maybe a week left unless something changes. You're asking me to give up my legal claim to the dog. I'm asking you to save the life of the animal who tried to save your father, Thomas replied. Rex has spent 3 years trying to complete a mission that began when your father took my place in that convoy. Let him finish it. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that Michael had to choose whether to cross, carrying with it the weight of 3 years of misdirected anger and a lifetime of misunderstood sacrifice. The El Paso County Courthouse had never seen a legal proceeding quite like the one that unfolded on that crisp November morning. Michael Thompson sat beside his expensive Denver attorney, but his posture had changed fundamentally since their last appearance. Gone was the rigid anger that had characterized his previous testimony, replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. Thomas watched from the plaintiff's table as Michael conferred quietly with his lawyer Bradley Pierce, whose confusion was evident in every gesture. Judge Hendricks called the session to order with the brisk efficiency of someone who had spent too many years mediating human conflicts to be surprised by their complexity. We're here for final disposition in the matter of Wilson Frears Thompson regarding custody of retired military working dog Rex. Mr. Pierce, I understand your client wishes to make a statement? Pierce stood reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with whatever his client had decided. Yes, Your Honor, though I must note that my client is acting against my legal advice. So noted, Judge Hendricks replied dryly. Mr. Thompson, you may proceed. Michael rose from his chair with the measured movements of someone who had spent sleepless nights arriving at a difficult decision. He looked across the courtroom at Thomas, then at the gallery filled with supporters who had followed their story before turning his attention to the judge. Your Honor, I need to begin with an apology, Michael said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. 3 years ago, I abandoned Rex at a kill shelter in Pueblo because I couldn't bear to look at him. I told myself it was because he had failed to protect my father, but the truth is that I was angry at a dead man and I took it out on his dog. The admission sent ripples through the gallery, but Michael continued without pause. Last week, I learned the classified details of my father's death for the first time. I saw helmet camera footage that showed Rex detecting the IED that killed my father, trying to save multiple soldiers, and getting shot twice in the process of attempting to rescue his handler. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her expression intent. Are you saying you were not previously aware of the dog's actions during the incident that killed your father? That's correct, Your Honor. The Army classified the tactical details, so my family never knew that Rex was a hero that day, or that my father specifically volunteered to take another soldier's place in the convoy. Michael's voice wavered slightly as he continued. For 3 years I've been punishing a dog for surviving when my father didn't. But Rex didn't fail his mission. I failed mine. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Michael reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. Your Honor, I'm formally transferring all ownership rights for Rex to Thomas Wilson, effective immediately. No conditions, no restrictions. This dog deserves to live with someone who understands his value as more than just an animal. Bradley Pierce looked like he wanted to disappear into his expensive suit. Your Honor, my client is emotionally compromised and making decisions that— Mr. Pierce, Judge Hendricks interrupted sharply. Your client appears to be making the first rational decision I've heard in this case. Mr. Thompson, you understand that this transfer is permanent and legally binding? Yes, Your Honor. It's what should have happened 3 years ago. The gavel came down with finality that echoed through Thomas's chest like a heartbeat restored to life. After months of legal limbo and bureaucratic indifference, Rex officially belonged to the man who had been caring for him all along. But even as relief flooded through him, Thomas knew that the real work was just beginning. The dash to the animal control facility felt like a race against time itself. Rex had been refusing food for 6 days, and Dr. Peterson's last update had been grimly pessimistic about the dog's chances. Military working dogs possessed the same psychological vulnerabilities as their human counterparts. They could literally die from emotional trauma when their sense of purpose and belonging was destroyed. Officer Martinez met them at the facility entrance with the kind of expression that medical professionals develop when delivering news that families don't want to hear. "He's in bad shape," she said without preamble. "Dr. Peterson thinks he's got maybe 24 hours left. He's just given up." The walk through the concrete corridors felt like a funeral march. Other dogs barked and whined at the sight of visitors, but kennel number 7 remained silent. Rex lay in the far corner of his enclosure, curled into a position that made him appear smaller than his 80-pound frame should have allowed. His breathing was shallow and labored, and his magnificent coat had lost the luster that spoke of health and vitality. "Rex," Thomas called softly, pressing his face against the chain link. "I'm here, boy. I'm here, and I'm not leaving." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Thomas's voice, but he didn't lift his head. 3 years of abandonment and broken promises had taught him that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. But Michael's presence seemed to register on some deeper level. His body tensed slightly, as if recognizing a scent that carried complicated memories. Michael knelt beside Thomas at the kennel door, his voice thick with emotion. "Rex, I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry for what I did to you." Officer Martinez unlocked the kennel door, and Thomas entered slowly, not wanting to startle an animal who had been traumatized too many times. Rex watched his approach with dull eyes that held no expectation of comfort, but when Thomas sat down beside him and began stroking his head with gentle persistence, something fundamental shifted in the dog's posture. "It's over," Thomas whispered into Rex's ear. "The fighting is over. You're coming home." Michael entered the kennel hesitantly, his movements careful and apologetic. When he sat down on Rex's other side, the dog's breathing quickened slightly, not with fear but with something that might have been recognition. "He looks just like he did when I was a kid," Michael said softly. "Dad used to bring him home on weekends sometimes before deployment. I remember thinking he was the most beautiful dog I'd ever seen." "Your father was proud of this partnership," Thomas said, continuing to stroke Rex's head. "Military working dogs aren't just animals, they're soldiers." Rex served his country with the same honor as any human in uniform. Over the next hour, something miraculous began to happen. Rex's breathing gradually steadied, and he began to respond to Thomas's voice and touch with subtle signs of returning life. When Michael tentatively placed his hand on Rex's flank, the dog didn't flinch away. Instead, he seemed to relax further, as if some long-held tension was finally releasing. Dr. Peterson arrived with IV fluids and emergency medications, but what she found defied veterinary explanation. "His vitals are stabilizing," she announced with amazement. "Heart rate is coming down, temperature is normalizing. Whatever you two are doing, keep doing it." "We're completing the mission," Thomas said simply. "Rex has been carrying the weight of unfinished business for 3 years. Now he knows it's done." The drive back to Thomas's house felt like a victory parade with an audience of one. Rex rode in the passenger seat, still weak but alert, his head turned toward the window as familiar neighborhoods rolled past. When they pulled into the driveway on Maple Street, Maria Santos was waiting on her porch with tears streaming down her face. "Gracias a Dios," she called out, hurrying over as Thomas helped Rex out of the truck. "The whole neighborhood has been praying for this day." Rex's return to the house triggered a homecoming that felt almost ceremonial. He moved through the rooms with careful deliberation, reclaiming territory that had belonged to him in spirit if not in law. When he settled into his familiar spot beside Thomas's recliner, it was with the satisfied sigh of a soldier finally relieved of duty. Michael stayed for dinner that evening, the first of what would become regular visits. As they sat around Thomas's kitchen table, three men of different generations united by their connection to Bear Thompson's memory, Rex lay between them like a living bridge across years of misunderstanding and grief. "I want to learn about my father," Michael said as they finished Maria's latest casserole offering. "Not the angry version I created in my head, but who he really was as a soldier and a handler. He was the kind of man who would take another soldier's place in a dangerous convoy without hesitation," Thomas replied. "The kind who earned a dog's absolute loyalty by being worthy of it." "And Rex?" Thomas looked down at the dog, whose amber eyes held a peace that had been absent for too long. "Rex is going to help other veterans like us. Military working dogs make exceptional therapy animals. They understand trauma in ways that regular dogs can't." The plan that emerged over the following weeks was ambitious but necessary. Thomas would work with Dr. Mitchell to establish a formal program placing retired military working dogs with veterans struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt. Rex would be their first success story, living proof that healing was possible for both human and canine warriors. 6 months later, Thomas stood in his backyard watching Rex work with a young Marine named David Chen, who had lost 3 limbs to an IED in Syria. The dog's patient, intuitive understanding of trauma was helping David process grief that traditional therapy hadn't been able to touch. Nearby, Michael Thompson was building a memorial garden dedicated to fallen handlers and their military working dog partners. "You think Dad would be proud of how this turned out?" Michael asked, pausing in his work to watch Rex guide David through a particularly difficult memory. Thomas considered the question as evening light painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and purple. Bear Thompson had died saving one soldier, but his legacy was now touching dozens of lives through the program that bore his name. Rex had found his post-military mission, and Michael had found a way to honor his father's memory that transformed grief into service. "Your father's been watching over all of us," Thomas replied, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. "Rex was just his way of making sure we found each other." In the gathering twilight, Rex looked up from his work and met Thomas's eyes across the yard, his expression holding the contentment of a soldier whose mission was finally completely accomplished. At 68, Thomas Wilson thought his story was over. Another forgotten veteran counting down empty days in an empty house. Like so many of us who've given our best years to service, family, and duty, he felt invisible, useless, forgotten by a world that had moved on without him. But sometimes God sends us exactly what we need in the most unexpected package. Rex wasn't just a lost dog. He was a fellow warrior carrying his own invisible wounds, searching for purpose just like Thomas. Together they discovered that our greatest chapters often begin when we think the book is closing. Thomas found that healing doesn't come from forgetting our pain, but from using it to serve something greater than ourselves. Rex taught him that loyalty, courage, and unconditional love never retire. They just find new missions. Their story reminds us that no matter how forgotten we feel, there's always someone who needs what we have to give. Whether it's a neighbor, a grandchild, or even a 4-legged friend, purpose finds us when we're ready to serve again. At any age, at any stage, we can still make a difference. We can still matter. We can still come home to hope. What moment in your life made you feel most needed? Have you ever found unexpected purpose when you thought your best days were behind you? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.